In this video, I'll be showing you how to use the select and mask technique to effectively select hair in Adobe Photoshop. You can follow along with the support files that I've attached to this lecture, or you can use your own photos. And if you're taking your own photos, I suggest taking photos of a subject like a friend or a colleague who will let you take photos of them. Make sure you have a simple background, just a wall that's just one color, instead of having a complicated background, because it makes it a lot easier to delineate the subject from the background on that layer. If you follow along with these support files, we do have a background in the photo of the model, but there's enough differentiation between the background and the subject so we can make an effective selection. But that's just something to consider. In some of the video lessons in this course, we need to refine the edge of a selection, especially when we want to select hair, for example. Now, if you have an older version of Photoshop, you would use what's called Refine Edge, and I'll show you in this video how to access those older features, but Photoshop updated their software so that we have something called Select and Mask, and that really replaced Refine Edge, although some of the options are the same, and I'll show you what I mean. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to use the Photoshop Select and Mask feature. Now again, Select and Mask replaced the older Refine Edge technique, which is from an earlier version of Photoshop. So if you have an older version, you will continue to use Refine Edge. But if you have the newest Creative Cloud update, it should say Select and Mask instead. I have kept the older Refine Edge technique in this course in part of the next video, for example. If you have the most recent version of Creative Cloud, we can still access the older Refine Edge technique. To do that, first let's make a selection. I'll use the quick selection tool here and just click and drag over this model here. Then we press Shift on the keyboard and go to Select, and then Select and Mask. And that brings us to the Refine Edge panel, and this is from the earlier version of Photoshop. It has Smooth, Feather, Contrast, Shift, Edge, which are also in the new Select and Mask technique, but the newer Select and Mask technique has other options as well. I'm going to click Cancel, and then also deselect. We can select the Marquee Selection tool and just click anywhere, or go to Select, Deselect, or Control or Command D. Now that technique to bring up the older Refine Edge panel only works if we have an active selection first using one of these tools before we go to Select and then Select and Mask. And again, we need to hold Shift when we do that. Now in the Select and Mask technique, we can first make a selection, for example with the quick selection tool here. And if you don't see this, make sure, again, we have Window, Tools checked, and also Options up at the top there. So I can just click and drag over the model here. Then we can click Select and Mask, and it will bring up these options. I'm going to click Cancel though. Instead of making a selection first, we can click Select Subject. If I click it now, it will have a warning. This will discard our current selection. That's fine. What that does is Adobe Photoshop software tries to figure out where the edge of the selection should be. So I'll just deselect first and then select, for example, the quick selection tool. Then just press Select Subject without making a selection first, and it does a pretty good job. So now we can click Select and Mask after Photoshop software selected the subject for us. And up here by default, it's probably on onion skin, so it shows just a transparent background here, and it looks pretty good so far. We can adjust the edge here though to make it an even better selection. Now we can change this up here from onion skin to marching ants. That just shows where the edge of selection will be. We can also select overlay. That allows us to specify a specific color as our background. And we can also just say on black, on white, black and white, which shows the edge a little bit better here in this context. And then on layers. Now I'm going to layer this first. So I'm going to go ahead and click Cancel and select the landscape file, which is in the support files area as well. And I'm just going to use the move tool here and click and drag it over, or we could copy and paste it, or we could go to File, Place, but either way, I'm going to make sure the layers panel is up here. I'm going to double click the background layer to make it a normal layer. And then I want this landscape layer to be below the portrait here. But I want to make sure that it's right along the edge here. So I do need to deselect. So again, Control or Command D will deselect. And I'm just going to match this up to the edge here. And so we have the background here, and we have the portrait on top. And so let's just go back and go to Select Subject, and then Select and Mask. And this will look a little bit different this time. So if I go to Onion Skin, instead of showing that transparent checkerboard background pattern, telling us that there are no pixels there, we actually can see through this to this landscape photo in the back. And if we adjust this transparency, we can see this original layer, and then the effect of the subject having a new background if we go to 100% for transparency. So we can make it more opaque and more transparent. So if I leave it about in the middle at 50%, that's fine for this example. Now over on the left-hand side, we have the tools. So up here is Quick Selection tool, and that works pretty similar to just the regular Quick Selection tool back in the normal toolbar here in Photoshop. So I'm going to set this to Overlay, and then if I just click and drag the edge here, you can see it tries to figure out the edge as I click and drag. I'm going to press Control or Command Z to undo that though. So that uses an algorithm to try to find the edge, just like earlier with the Quick Selection tool. However, if I use the Refine Edge Brush tool, that refines the edge a little bit better, but we're going to use that on the hair later, so I'm going to skip that for now. The Brush tool does not use any algorithm to try to find an edge just like these top two tools do. What it does is just has a function of masking out or bringing it back in just wherever we click and drag, just like a brush tool. So I'm going to press Control or Command Z to undo that. Now up here on the options panel, if I click the minus sign here, the symbol, and if I click and drag, it's going to remove pixels, right? And if I press this plus sign, it's going to bring those back in, right? Now a shortcut though is while this plus sign, this default, is selected, if I hold Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac, it does remove from the selection. And if I don't hold Alt or Option, then it adds to it, like so. All right, I'm pressing Control or Command Z to undo that though. And of course, we can adjust the brush up here if we want a soft edge brush or a hard edge brush, and also the size. And we can press the left or right bracket on the keyboard, and that will resize our brush tools as well. And also on the left-hand side here, we also have the polygonal lasso tool and the lasso tool. So just like in the normal toolbar in Photoshop, if I click and drag, I can create an area that adds to or removes from the mask or the selection. And so that's just click and drag. And then if I go to the polygonal lasso tool, that's if I click and let go, click and let go, click and let go, click and let go, double click, and it creates an area that we're either adding to or removing from that selection or mask. And we should know what these are, just the hand tool and the zoom tool. If I select the zoom tool here and click and drag left and right, we can zoom in and zoom out. But of course, as usual, we can also use Control on the PC, Command on the Mac, and the minus and plus keyboard shortcuts. And then if we're zoomed in and we press the space bar, we can click and drag after toggling to the hand tool there by pressing the space bar. So we don't have to use those, but we can if we need to. Now, all of these can be helpful in certain contexts. So for example, something like this here, and I'm not going to go through every single area here and waste time. I don't want to bore you in this tutorial. I just want to show you the methods, and then we can use those methods to either this example or other portraits or landscapes in this course. The polygonal lasso tool is helpful when we have an area that has straight edges like this that we need to either add to or remove from a selection or a mask. So up here on the top, we can see that it says add to selection, subtract from, or intersect. So instead of holding Alt or Option, just like with these brush tools up here, we select one of these ahead of time. So I know we are going to need to use this second one, subtract from selection, before we start our selection here. So once we've clicked that, now I can click right along this edge until we get back to the beginning, and there we go. So that's the context where we would use the polygonal lasso tool, and it's still not perfect, but we can make a couple adjustments. We can go back in again, either use a brush tool or use one of the lasso tools. For example, with the lasso tool, if I click up here with the second option there and then click and drag around, you get the idea. All right. There are a couple areas where that automated selection did not work as well. So we can go into each of those and use specific tools. So the quick selection tool, I don't want to use right here because it'll probably select too much. So if I click and drag, set it to minus, it doesn't work as well. If I go to the Refine Edge brush tool, that works a little bit better on hair. So if I click and drag, see how that does a pretty good job there actually. It's got a little bit of fringing on the edges, but I'll show you how to fix that. And if we go to brush, that's when we have a definite edge. So like in here, we could use the polygonal lasso tool again, or we could just click after setting it to minus, or hold Alt or Option and just click and drag. And we can adjust this after the fact as well. So I'm going to go up here and just look around the edges here. Now right here, I think we could use the quick selection tool. Make sure plus is selected there. And we're just bringing some of that back in here. But we don't want that in there. So again, I can make the brush smaller, hold Alt or Option to subtract from. So hopefully you get the idea. Depending on what we want to remove from or add to the selection, we would use any of these options up here. So when we have brush tool, we have a definite edge, something we want to either bring in or remove from a selection or mask. And then Refine Edge brush is better for hair, for example, like this. Just clicking and dragging on the edge here. And what I find useful is to bring this opacity down to 0 and then back up to 100 and see if there's any hair there that is being masked out that we need to bring back in. So I'm using the Refine Edge brush tool, but I'm bringing this back down to 0%, then 100. We could keep it at 50% or so just to see the midway point, but again, I can press spacebar to move around the canvas like that. All right, spacebar, click and drag over here, and so on. So we would go along the edges and use the Refine Edge brush tool and see if there's any areas that we need to really adjust so some of that hair shows through still.